Coming to you from 4,200 feet in the hills of Oregon, it is the voice of Chi-Town, the reddest beard in the high desert, your host of the MOA Broadcast, Sam Wilson. All right, folks, we have got a great show lined up for you today. Lots of good info, a couple of show highlights to get us started. We have... When it comes to the crime department, we have both sledgehammer and shovel attacks. We're going to address the buttered coffee that we discussed last week's episode again, get into a little bit more detail on that. We had a few questions about that. We're going to cover, we didn't get a chance to get to this story last week, but there's actually a hiker that did it right. So I want to make sure we get some praise there and analyze the good things that can happen when someone prepares and plans ahead properly to make it out alive. Then we've got, oh boy, here we go, COVID. We got COVID shot lawsuits. COVID is like Florida. It is the topic that just keeps on giving. And we're going to wrap it up with a drug-fueled, well, you know what? We'll let that story at the very end. You'll get a kick out of it. Let's get started then. We go to Kenosha. A woman arrested after alleged sledgehammer attack on roommate. For those of you that aren't in the U.S., Kenosha is in Wisconsin, a northern state. A violent attack early Monday morning has left a woman hospitalized and a repeat offender back in police custody. Early Monday morning, Kenosha police responded to a 911 call from the area of 54th Street and 14th Avenue, where reports indicated that a woman had attacked her roommate with a sledgehammer. Upon arrival, emergency responders transported the victim to a nearby hospital, and she is expected to survive. Now, get a load of this. After a brief manhunt, it was a woman, but it was a brief manhunt we see here. Authorities located and arrested Jessica D. Lentz, 46 of Kenosha. They requested her be charged with attempted homicide. Now, this is the interesting part of the story. Two things here. Number one, what could the roommate have done potentially? We don't know. She may have done everything right. The one who was the victim. What could she have done to prevent this situation? That's what we constantly talk about, right? This is it. How do we make it out alive? But preparedness. How do you avoid the bad situation? What could she have done? And then what could the state have done? Because the part that's coming under fire for this whole thing is this woman has an extensive, we're going to read some of it real quick. She has an extensive criminal record, and yet she was still out here committing crimes. Starting in 2008, this is the aggressor, the attacker. She was charged with felony domestic battery and intimidation of a victim. She got a plea deal in probation, which was later revoked, leading to an 8-month jail sentence. 2009, very next year, charged with criminal trespass to a dwelling and felony bail jumping. The felony charge was dismissed, and she again got probation. She violated that probation and was sentenced to only 30 days in jail. 2013, armed bank robbery. Guilty plea, 8 years prison. Did some time on that one. 2024, that would explain the quiet period from 2013 to 2024. Man, arrested for felony cocaine possession on November 15. On February 19, Judge Angelina Gabrielle approved another plea deal, granting her probation despite her extensive history of probation violations. At the time of Monday's attack, the attacker allegedly here, was still on probation from her most recent drug-related conviction. She has only one felony conviction due to the Kenosha County DA's office previous soft-on-crime stance. So that's the problem. That's what's coming under fire right now, or what that particular news article was focusing on is why has jail and or prison been a revolving door for this particular woman? And apparently they have a problem with it otherwise, because they referred in the other article multiple times to the soft on crime stance there with the Kenosha County DA's office. You would think if someone had committed all of those crimes inside of a basically one, two, three, most of that was done in a 3 to 4 year period that's listed here, especially if you take out the 8 years she was in prison, that somebody would be doing some serious time. But it wasn't until she, according to the article, committed an armed bank robbery and pled guilty, and that was only 8 years. You would think that an armed bank robbery would be more than 8 years. Anyway, I guess not. Whatever. That's the problem. Now, the first thing that jumped out at me was, what did the lady who was letting this woman stay in her house as a roommate or whoever, I don't know who owned the dwelling, it doesn't really say, what on earth kind of screening process do you have for roommates if this lady made it through? That's a pretty extensive rap sheet. I mean, obviously some people have done a lot more, but that was a pretty active 2008 to 2013. And then she was out of circulation for 8 years. I guess she did the whole 8 year bit. What was your screening process like before you either let this person into your apartment / home, whatever, or you moved into hers? I mean, that's some scary stuff, man. I've had roommates in the past, and I've always been accepted. If I didn't know the person personally, or had good friends that that knew them personally and vouched for them, we didn't even get to the background check or anything like that. So because that was it. If they didn't come vouched for by close personal friends, end of story. It's hard to imagine. Of course, it doesn't say the lady who the victim here may have had a criminal record too. I don't know. Anyway, that is one scary case, being attacked with a sledgehammer. But we go from the sledgehammer, while we're still out in the tool shed, to a shovel. Let's read the headline and we'll get right into it. This time we go to Brazil. Frightening moment, unhinged shopper casually grabs shovel and attacks unsuspecting store manager. What is wrong with people? I read these headlines. These are just the ones. I've only got, an hour or less on this show to share this stuff with you guys. The amount of research that I do, I don't do this with AI or stuff like that. I do manual, good old-fashioned, old-school research and look up articles and news events and so forth. The number of articles that either don't make the cut or I don't have time to get to is staggering. But they're crazy. Let's get to it. A surveillance camera captured the moment a man calmly grabbed a shovel, a shovel from a store shelf, and walked up behind a manager before clocking him in the head with it. Now, I'm not laughing at the poor manager. This is horrible. But this stuff is so insane. Like, what would cause you to go into a store? Let's keep going. But to go into a store and take a shovel. Okay. The footage showed, I'm not even going to try and pronounce this name. I'm guessing it's Portuguese as far as language. So the aggressor, allegedly 29 years old, entered the Machado supermarket in Brazil on Saturday afternoon and approached a display area. He is seen removing one of the shovels and walking over. And I saw the video. This guy was very calm. If I recall, he was wearing like flip-flops. He just walks in and grabs the shovel and then goes over, walked up behind a manager before clocking him in the head with it. He just smacked him in the back of the head. Fortunately, there was some good luck or good fortune for the manager. Let's get to that. The footage showed the aggressor, approach a display, blah, blah, blah. He is seen removing a shovel, and he walks over to Claudio dos Santos, 40, who had his back turned and was talking on his cell phone. That particular point is important. According to the military police, the aggressor confronted dos Santos after his wife, I guess this is the alleged reason why, who works. So the shovel man's wife works at the supermarket, had complained about the manager. Dos Santos, that's the manager, the victim in this, told Brazilian news outlet G1 that he had never had any type of communication with the aggressor's wife prior to the attack. I don't have contact with the employees, but I always hold the leaders accountable, Dos Santos, the manager, explained. I don't know how she conveyed this information. I think she told her husband that I had morally harassed her, but I didn't have any contact with this employee. Now imagine, you're, not to put this job down at all, but you're just a regular manager at a supermarket. This shouldn't be a high-risk, violent situation type job in a normal world. And you're just walking around talking on your cell phone, and some guy walks up and smacks you in the back of the head with a shovel. Holy smokes. Now, this is the interesting part. Because of an alleged story that doesn't even make sense. Somebody's not telling the truth, right? Or something's wrong because the wife is saying that the manager did something or said something to her. She didn't like him or I don't know what. And the manager's saying he never had any contact with her. So I'm sure there's going to be an interesting conversation on that jail phone. He said his injuries, the manager, that is, Dos Santos, could have been much worse had he not been talking on his cell phone. He, the attacker, really wanted to kill me, and what saved me was my cell phone, which shattered inside my ear, and I had to get stitches. So the phone, I guess the guy wasn't that great of a shot or didn't care, but the guy was holding his phone up to his ear while talking on a phone conversation, and that's where the shovel impacted and did its damage. So if that phone, even though it shattered the phone, and I guess probably the glass screen or whatever particles cut up his ear, I don't know how bad it was, but stitches to your ear doesn't sound fun. That probably protected him from a much worse impact and the concussive force of being hit by a shovel in the head. Man, that is some crazy stuff. Guys, be careful out there. That again, and I will say nothing against the manager. This is not his fault. He's not a victim. He was walking around very, just completely oblivious because if you see the video for this guy walks in, he looks like he's coming in to get peanuts and a Coke. And he walks over to the shovel display area and gets a shovel. And the manager, just happens to have his back turned. He just walks straight up and just goes to town on this guy with a shovel. So you got to be what they call situationally aware. And that is, again, one of the points of this show is be thinking about, I mean, no one really expects to get hit in the head with a shovel. Let's be honest, right? But man, there's another expression. They say, keep your head on a swivel. It means keep your head moving around. We don't want to make people paranoid. I don't want to be paranoid or constantly fearing for my life. But being aware is very important, as Mr. Dos Santos found out. We hope he gets a fast and effective recovery. Okay, now we're going to get to the butter and coffee thing. So I got a couple of emails and messages through the website thing over this. People are like, what do you mean you add? I think I explained it pretty well, but maybe I wasn't. I don't know. When you're sitting here talking in front of a microphone and the camera's on and all, lights and all that stuff, sometimes you bounce over things. Plus you got to keep track of time and all the other stories and so on. This I've been doing this off and on since around 2000 to 2002. I'm not exactly sure when I started, but somewhere in there. And I've never really liked traditional, like artificial coffee creamers and sweeteners. They're so sweet. And the other thing is, if you look at the ingredients list, there's so many chemicals, and you're taking something that, in my opinion, there is some scientific debate on this, but very little in my opinion. But anyways, that is so pure and good, like coffee, one ingredient, all you really got to do is find a way to run hot water through it in one fashion or another, and you've got this great drink. However, sometimes you may not want the full strength of coffee, and some people just don't like the flavor that much of straight up coffee. So what I do is, not every day, but most days I would say probably, I have grass-fed butter that's not that expensive. If you look at the cost of the other products and how much you actually use of butter, grass-fed butter is not that expensive, but it's very, very good. It's very smooth and creamy. And when you add it to the coffee, that's what it does. It gives it a very smooth, creamy flavor, depending on how much you add, obviously. I typically put somewhere between a teaspoon and a tablespoon. And I don't do that. I drink a lot of coffee. I've mentioned that before, close to probably a liter usually, at least each day. I don't do that to every single cup of coffee, usually the first 2 or 3, and then I kind of just, go rogue from there and drink it straight. As I mentioned before, sometimes I will add raw sugar or the turbinado type sugar. It's the brown stuff that hasn't been bleached. The sugar in the raw, they call it. There's different types, obviously, and they have different brand names sometimes. That's very good. I like that flavor. It gives almost a brown sugar type of flavor to your coffee. Depending on the type of coffee you have, I drink a French roast almost every day, and it's got a little bit of a nutty and chocolatey, hints to it. And the brown sugar flavor profile really complements that and brings out those notes. I know some people, I have the most sensitive palate, but I've been around some people, their palate does not pick up on that at all. You could give them Maxwell House frozen crystals or whatever, and then you could give them the best cup of coffee in the world and they wouldn't notice the difference. That's fine. That's not a put down. It's just like an eye for detail. I've worked in a number of trades and industries where you have to have an eye for detail as to perfection and so forth. Some people just do not see things the same way as other people. But anyway, all that being aside, before we get off topic too much, the butter really gives it a nice creamy profile, and you're not adding anything. They recommend unsalted. I use whatever is handiest on the counter and the butter dish. I don't refrigerate it, so that way it melts a lot quicker, whether it's on bread or steak or coffee. Delicious, very good flavor. But there are other ingredients. So sometimes you've heard of I think it's called the bulletproof coffee, and then there are other variations of this buttered coffee recipe. The bulletproof or whatever this is, I don't do that one. Nothing against it. I don't have a problem with that. But they will add butter and sometimes MCT oil. MCT oil is the medium chain triglycerides. Basically, you get in the form of coconut oil, and I forget the other oil that you can add. The purpose leaves, let me read this. It is a type of fat. This is the MCT oil. It is a type of fat that contains medium chain fatty acids, which are shorter than the fatty acids found in most other fats. MCT oil is typically extracted from, here we go, coconut oil or palm kernel oil. This typically people that do this are on like the low carb diets because there is no carb penalty for doing this. Next page here. When you do it with the unsalted grass-fed butter does taste better, in my opinion. It's got a deeper, richer flavor. Maybe, I don't know if I had them side to side, gun to my head, would I tell them apart? I don't know. I think so, but you just go for the grass-fed. It's supposed to be healthier anyway. The idea is it's supposed to, the proponents of the butter coffee and the MCT and butter bulletproof coffee, all this stuff, it's supposed to provide sustained energy, improve focus, and can help with weight loss or satiety. I don't know about that particular part. I do know that whenever here we go. This is the part that I feel I understand or I agree with. The high fat content is believed to slow down caffeine absorption, potentially providing a more gradual and longer lasting energy boost than regular coffee. I don't know if I agree with or go along with a longer lasting energy boost. It feels to me though like it softens the blow. Sometimes I wake up and you get that first cup of coffee or two in there, and it's just it's a harsh acidic liquid. And your stomach kind of rebels. It's like, ugh, it stings a little bit after a while. I have noticed when I add the butter, which is a pretty regular thing now, unless I'm out somewhere, it reduces that impact. So that's the part to me that I like most. I don't know if I would really say that some users report enhanced mental clarity and focus. I don't know about that. I don't think I've ever noticed that, but I haven't done any kind of study, so whatever. But that is the idea here. So for those of you that want to give it a try, I would start with you don't got to get anything crazy. You can go to the supermarket and get regular, salt-free or unsalted butter and go from there. I would recommend the grass-fed butter as a nice flavor to it. So anyway, that's that. Typically what I'll do is, especially if I'm using like the AeroPress, I'll put almost a tablespoon of the butter in the cup first, then go ahead and press the coffee. And as I put the AeroPress on there, as it drips through a little bit, it starts melting it. So by the time you're done in a minute and a half, your coffee's already melted, requires very little stirring, and you're good to go. Okay, let's get to some fan mail. This was a popular segment last time. People enjoyed the fan mail. We've got several this week. I'm only going to have time to get two. We've got a full show. I'm probably going to have to be cutting some stuff on the fly here as I do some managerial time management on the fly. But let's get to it. Both of these are on the same topic. That's why we're going to group them together and kind of run with them. Let me get a sip here. Okay. If you've been watching or listening to the show, either for those of you who don't know, if you go to gearconvoy.com, there's a tab at the top, www.gearconvoy.com. You can find a tab for the MOA Broadcast, and there's all kind of information. You can get all the episodes there. They're linked from Spotify. You can do it on Spotify itself. We've got Apple Podcast, Amazon, most of the major ones. But I like Spotify. It has a really good user interface for me. And then it will notify you every time there's a new episode, which is, every Saturday morning when they come out, or sometimes Friday night when it gets uploaded. But we also have a Patreon page there where you can go in for a small monthly subscription, very small. You can get access to the full video versions if you enjoy that. So anyway, let's get to this. I've covered a lot of crime in New York City recently. As you know, I've spent a lot of time in New York City, and things have changed. There's always been crime there, make no mistake, but it's been pretty interesting recently. That being said, all of which was accurate, a couple of our listeners have a more positive opinion of New York City and state, and we're going to share that. I'm happy to share that. First up, we have Eric, an amateur painter trainee or apprentice, I'm not sure, from Portland, Oregon. Don't get me started on Portland. I used to live there. What an absolute dumpster fire that city has become. I'll just say this, and I'll keep the PG censored version for this brief snippet. The last time I was in Portland, I was walking down the street downtown in a very crowded or busy street during midday, broad daylight, and there was a man with his pants around his ankles washing his private parts in a public drinking fountain. That is all you need to know about Portland, in my opinion. I'm sure there's still some good parts. Maybe they're making an effort to clean it up. Anyway, let's get moving. Eric says he had some other things. He liked the kangaroos. The kangaroos. Dude, those guys, there's some straight up killers with bad attitudes. Those kangaroos are. Anyway, Mr. Painter Apprentice says, Eric, and New York City is awesome still. We stayed, referring to him and his wife and children, we stayed on the Lower East Side / Chinatown / Bowery last summer for a week. So fun. Don't believe all those news stories. They have an agenda too. Number one, I agree with you. Thank you for the input, Eric. Much appreciated. We glad to hear that. Number two, I also agree that news stories have an agenda. That's why here at the Make It Out Alive broadcast, our rule of thumb is we give you the data. We may give a little bit of color commentary here and there, but we give you the data and you make your own decision about the information. So positive story from Eric. I'm not going to have time for that. Let's skip to this. I will say New York City is it's an amazing place. I'm sure even now. Years ago, though, I mean, it was it's an amazing place. If you've never been there, it's difficult to see and experience all the things that you will in just an hour or two walk around the city, or especially if you ride the subway in various parts of the city that you get in a day like that. I've mentioned before about the beef patties and pizza. So I used to run around in Brooklyn a lot, and there were two places I would go in Brooklyn, and I'll keep this brief. One was Grimaldi's. Grimaldi's is very famous. They have delicious pizza. But there was one just a couple of blocks over that I usually would go to because it had a shorter line, and I liked the pizza just as good in a slightly different way. It was Fascati's, and I believe I checked. They're both still operational. So if you're ever in the neighborhood, Fascati's, and Fascati's was run at the time by an Italian, I believe they were a family, but they were Italians, and they would sit there and sling the dough and do the whole thing just like in the movie. So if you've never seen that before, it's really cool, and they make good pizza. A couple of slices and a can of Coca-Cola, and you had yourself a good Friday night. Okay, moving on. We've got our next email is Zach from New York. Also, Zach, however, is from upstate New York. Now, for those of you, again, especially outside the United States, when people think of New York, they think of New York City, which is in New York State, and that's all most of them know or think about. Even many Americans have never really experienced New York outside of the city itself. Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and so forth. You get upstate, things start changing very rapidly. It becomes a lot more, honestly, like almost like the Midwest in some ways. The people are not the same as the city. They're very, very friendly, good folks, in my experiences. So, got to be fair, and that was Zach. His point as well. He wants to be sure that people know how beautiful and nice the Saratoga Springs area is, which is presumably where he lives or close to it. We can do that. Now, I haven't spent a lot of time in Saratoga Springs. I've been through it on the way to other locations. So instead of giving personal color commentary from my past, I will simply read a glowingly positive review from, this was a website I found, iloveny.com. And I'll just read this word for word. About Saratoga Springs, New York. Known across the world for thoroughbred horse racing and its wealth of mineral waters that made it the ideal setting for America's first resort, Saratoga Springs is an excellent place to visit all year long. Nestled at the foothills of the Adirondacks, just south of Lake George and just north of the state capital of Albany, Saratoga Springs offers top-notch lodging, dining, and cultural attractions, all with a backdrop that may remind you of a Norman Rockwell painting. It can only be described as a beautiful destination. Thank you very much, iloveny.com. So there you go, folks. It's not all bad in New York. Chicago, however, is a different matter. All right, if you want to send me emails, questions, comments, you got a problem with the way I comb my hair, you don't like my face, or you want to talk about some news story or want something broached, send an email, info@gearconvoy.com, and that will go to us. You can also find all kinds of information about the MOA Broadcast and a number of other excellent resources about the outdoors there, including the full video version. Okay, now we go to a hiker that did it right. We're going to split this because the break is coming up and I cannot fudge it. Okay, March 12, 2025, we go to Franconia, New Hampshire. On Tuesday, March 11, 2025, at 3:05 p.m., New Hampshire Fish and Game Conservation officers were notified that a Garmin inReach had been activated on Franconia Ridge near Mount Lincoln. Briefly, for those of you that don't know what a Garmin inReach is, it's a small electronic device about the size of a smaller size cell phone that relies on satellite communication. You can send text messages, SOS signals. I don't know if you can do phone calls on those or not. I haven't owned one, but I've got friends that have them. You can get them for a couple $100, and then depending on what you do with it, there are subscription fees monthly. But excellent move. Very, very smart by this hiker. Very smart. It came in handy. The inReach owner, who is the hiker, had come across... Wait a second. Yeah, the inReach owner had come across an injured hiker and activated his device. So, okay, so that sounds like it was another hiker, and the injured hiker wasn't the one that had it, but he still did good because we'll get to that later on in the story. The injured party had suffered a lower leg injury, but was making their way down the Falling Waters Trail. As conservation officers monitored the hiking group's progress, it became clear they were slowing down and would not make it, so a rescue was initiated. Members of the SAR team responded and got the victim to the trailhead, and the victim was able to transport himself from the trailhead to receive medical aid. So he must not have been injured too badly. The victim was identified as Lawrence Duell, 57, of Wells, Maine. Duell injured his leg while hiking between Lincoln Mountain and Mount Lafayette. Now, they don't go into great detail on this, but all they say at the very end was Duell was well prepared for a winter hike. The fact that they say that when most of these stories, they talk about how unprepared the hiker was and what a disaster he almost caused, and they want to charge him for the rescue, that speaks volumes. So something must have happened, but he had his bases covered. I didn't catch that before when I originally read that article, that it was the other hiker that rescued him that had the inReach device. So anyway, interesting little point. I read that story multiple times while doing this research and preparation. All right, coming up, we got to take a break. When we get back, we're going to get into hammock camping, COVID shot lawsuits, and more good times. Stay with us, folks. We got a good show coming up. More Make It Out Alive with Sam Wilson after this.
Want to get your business noticed? Sponsor a show on KKFO Gold Country Radio on 103.3 FM and create awareness through on-air announcements, our online stream at goldcountryradio.org, and our podcasts that live on forever. Your message reaches a broad local audience while also targeting listeners who choose to tune in to the shows they love. Plus, we promote your sponsorship across our website and social media. For more information, email goldcountryradio@gmail.com. Call 541-238-6989 or visit goldcountryradio.org. Gold Country Radio, your message heard locally and beyond.
You're listening to the MOA Broadcast with Sam Wilson. Will you make it out alive? And just like that, we are back for the second half of the show here at the MOA Broadcast. I am your host, Sam Wilson. Okay, let's get to it, folks. As we left it, we were talking about the hiker in Franconia, New Hampshire. So just to go over that real briefly, those inReach or other similar devices are, they call them, I think, PBLs, also personal, or PLBs, personal locator beacons. There are other names for them. Those are handy devices. I do a lot of my hiking by myself, and that's something I need to actually work on. I usually inform two people at least where I'm going to be and give a timetable and so forth, and drop pins along the way and so forth. But yeah, it's a good idea. That made a big difference for this guy. That being said, moving forward, we wanted to get into, we had a couple requests in earlier episodes. I didn't get a chance to answer those emails. I had mentioned the different type of backpacking I do. And what I typically do is hammock backpacking or hammock camping. So if you are not an outdoors person, or you don't do much backpacking or hiking or whatever, the two primary ways most people, maybe three, I guess, they form their shelter while camping and hiking and so forth, is usually either a tent or a hammock. Now, some people will do. I've done this in the past before. I've dallied and dabbled in ultralight and so forth. Now, I would say more what I do is what's called lightweight backpacking, not quite ultralight. If you get into this, it's really interesting. There are a number of different categories that this falls in, and what it really boils down to is how much your base pack weight. And again, there's sometimes a sliding scale of definitions, but usually it boils down to what is your base pack weight minus, in some cases, food and water, or in some cases, fully loaded, whatever. The ultralight, is going to wind up, the idea being, let me just keep this simple. The idea, because I'm not very good at staying on one thought here, as you may have noticed, we jump around a lot. The idea being the lighter the load on your back, the easier it is on your feet. And so you can go longer and enjoy the process of backpacking. Because to me, I'm not insane about it, but I like to cover miles. An average day for me on a normal trail that's not extreme elevation changes or really rough terrain, I would like to get a good 10 to 12, and on a really good day, 14 to maybe 16 miles if I'm kind of pushing it. That's going to be about the extent of my enjoyable pace per day while I'm going backpacking. The lighter you make the load on your back, the easier that is. Now, sometimes there are things you cannot control. I've had, here in Oregon especially, I've had some hikes where I have a Garmin watch. It's an older model. It's several years old now. GPS watch, and it measures everything, your atmospheric pressure and altitude and temperature and so on and so forth. The here in Oregon, though, you can easily find yourself finding an elevation change of 2,000 or 3,000 feet in one day easily. I got to go back. I think whenever I did Devil's Peak, which wound up topping out at around like 5,500 or 5,700 feet in elevation, I think I did over 3,000 feet gain in one day. That is, even if you're younger and in shape. The first time I did that, I was probably in my early 30s, and you could feel it on your knees. It wasn't just a matter of like old people and feeble knees. That's a lot of strenuous wear and tear when you've got a heavy backpack on and you're scrambling. And I remember the first time I did it too. It was raining. It was a nasty day. I was in the slush. There was mud, and it had been sleeting. And again, for people that don't do much in elevation changes, the higher you go in elevation, typically you can get some pretty severe weather. It comes out of nowhere, and it may be perfectly calm and nice and warm at a lower elevation, but as you continue to climb, you wind up getting more snow or precipitation. And you could see we got a train coming through. So for those of you who don't know, I used to do the MOA Broadcast in a sound booth, and now I do it out in my shop, so it's more open. We can add the video and so forth. In a sound booth, it was kind of hard to add the video. So there's the choo-choo train. Anyway, you can see the snow line. It's funny because whenever you see it like on in person, it's a little bit more gradual. But even then, when I was going that Devil's Peak hike a couple of years ago, I remember when I saw it, the snow line, it was almost like a line of demarcation right across the ground. You had bare ground, and then you had snow. It was almost an instantaneous line. It's almost like the timber line, when you see the trees stop and start and so forth. So anyway, what is the whole point of this? We're getting into hammock camping. The reason that originally attracted me to hammock camping is when I was when I lived in Missouri. Now, I lived close to the Ozarks in southeast Missouri years ago. That's where I was born and raised, actually. And when you go hiking there, a lot of times you're on very uneven ground, and you get these. This happened to me one time. This is what changed my way of thinking. We got a rainstorm in the middle of the night. I was younger. I was a kid at this point, but I had gone backpacking and I had my tent set up. I had all my stuff. I had a couple of buddies along. I think my dad was on that trip as well. And we got an absolute downpour, a deluge of a rainstorm in the middle of the night. And what happened? It flooded our camp, took some of our gear away. Our tents got flooded. We got soaking wet. This happened at like 1 or 2 in the morning, and we were absolutely soaking wet. It was a mess. It was not fun at all. It was like something out of a movie of like a camping trip gone wrong, because we were, we did a number of things wrong. I was like, I think 14 at the time. I know I wasn't 16 because I couldn't drive. Maybe 14 at the time, and we were camped on like a hill, and also in like a low area elevation wise, and the water just flooded us out. My buddy got swept away. I mean, he didn't get hurt or anything, but he got pushed down, took his tent away. He was hollering as he was being washed down this hill. Fortunately, I had a flatter spot. I didn't know what I was doing, but I got lucky, basically. Anyway, that experience shaped my perspective on the outdoors for a number of years, and still does. I reference that experience to this day. So hammock camping is, instead of getting a traditional 1 or 2 man, or 3 man, whatever it is you're going to do, tent. Sometimes hikers will split these things up. If you're not a backpacker, it's about weight distribution. So if you may want a 3 man tent, because it makes the load light. One person may carry the actual tent, one person carries the ground cloth, one guy takes the tent poles and the rain fly, so forth. I typically go backpacking either by myself or with one other person, or maybe 2, but usually it's not that tight as far as spreading everything out. Hammock camping is great because you don't have to worry about getting all the rocks out of your tent spot, your floor space, real estate, whatever you want to call it. So when you go and put a tent up, one of the things you've got to do is you got to find a relatively level area, because I'm going to tell you right now, it may not feel like it's a big difference, but if that space is even off a little bit, your brain, there's something going on in there that knows it, and it will. Some people it's more pronounced than with others. Your brain will know it, and I remember a number of times I've slept in tents where the ground wasn't level and something was off, and like my brain knew it, the equilibrium type situation, and I did not sleep well at all. So you have to find a relatively flat spot, and then you got to clear out rocks and other things, or else it can tear a hole in your tent. You'd be surprised how quickly a stray rock or two will wear a hole in the floor of your tent if you're not careful. That's why some people have a ground cloth, but then you have another item to pack and unpack and so forth. And so, plus if there's mud, when I moved out here to Oregon, everything, fortunately I was already hammock camping by the time I got here, but everything was wet on the ground. So the point is, what is hammock camping? There are hammocks. These are not like the hammocks you see in tropical environments, an open air hammock that you just lay in your backyard or between 2 palm trees on the beach. They're hammocks that are fully enclosed. They typically have a mosquito net built into them. So you're going to need 15 to 18 feet on average, give or take a little bit, between 2 trees, which is great because in Oregon, and again, you have to do this to your area of operations, or where you actually are going and doing this. But in Oregon, there are tons of trees, not a problem. And so you can go between 2 trees, no problem. And then you don't have to worry about, by being suspended above the ground in a hammock, you don't have to worry about whether the ground is muddy, whether it's mushy, whether there's lots of rocks or whatever else. The hammock gets you elevated above all of that. And depending on the type you use, I don't get paid for this. Here's a free plug though. I use a Hennessy hammock. There are a number of different brands, especially I bought that hammock or got it probably 15 years ago, give or take. I'm sure there have been a lot of technological advances. I haven't kept up with it. But this particular hammock has the mosquito net built in, so you will run a line, you tie it off to one tree, tie it off to another. The whole thing is in these little, what they call snake skins. The whole thing slides, it looks like a giant rolled up burrito, and you roll it up, and you will tie it off to one tree, unroll it, tie it to another tree, and then you slide these sleeves off, and the hammock pops out, okay? Then you will run a ridge line sometime, which is a line above the hammock that keeps your mosquito net off of you, okay? So it doesn't feel like you're being all smothered inside this hammock. That being said, I know this is probably difficult to picture. You can look this up on image searches or YouTube or wherever else. Hammock camping is great. You've got an automatic mosquito net built in. Typically, I'll go ahead and run my rainfly too. The rainfly, the rainfly I'll actually pack separately because the rainfly here in Oregon, now where I live now in the high desert, we don't get nearly the amount of precipitation as when I lived near the Columbia River Gorge in the Portland area. But when we get a lot of precipitation there, I would pack my rainfly separately, and I would be able to take, I had it timed, and everything was dialed down to the almost to the second. I could have my rainfly set up between two trees in about 90 seconds. And that way, if I'm hiking, let's say I'm 4, 5, 6 miles, whatever it is, 2 miles, doesn't matter. You want to go ahead and say, hey, it's kind of rainy, it's cold. I want to go ahead and make me, a cup of noodles or some soup or whatever. But it's drizzling because people think that in Portland it rains all the time. It's not like rain in a lot of parts of the United States where you get a hard, big raindrops and a hard rain. It's a constant drizzle. And so it's not that bad to deal with, but it does get annoying if you're trying to eat or read or whatever. So you would run this tarp between two trees, and you could sit there and then just sit on the ground or sit on a stump and make your little lunch with your camping stove. I always preferred here's a whole other episode. We'll come back to this because I don't have time today. I always liked alcohol stoves. There are the ISO and propane, butane. There are all kinds of fuel blends that you can get for the compressed fuel stoves that burn like little, they call them pocket rockets and other things. Those are great. I like the alcohol stoves because number one, they're very lightweight, extremely lightweight, like ounces. And you can just, if you run out of your propane cartridges, you may or may not be able to get those. Alcohol stoves run off of methanol or ethanol. You can get that at gas stations, at grocery stores, hardware stores, almost anywhere. And they burn well enough to boil 2 cups of water, which is typically what you need to make a pot of soup or warm up a hot meal or make some coffee. They do that in about 8 to 10, 12 minutes, depending on your elevation. The higher in elevation you go, the longer it takes. So anyway, I like alcohol stoves. They're great. That being said, you could run your tarp, sit there and make you a couple noodles and a cup of coffee and eat all that, drink it, and put it all back in your backpack in 20, 25 minutes total, with the tarp only taking 3 to 5 minutes for all that. So with a tent, you can't really do that. You don't have a separate tarp that you can run between trees and provide you shelter. And sometimes if you were hiking along and all of a sudden a rainstorm or thunderstorm came out of nowhere, you could just run that tarp between any two trees, 15, 18, 20 feet, and you could just sit there and wait it out. I used to carry books when I would go hiking, but when the cell phones came along and you could store so much info, plus have GPS and so forth, then I would download several books and I would just sit there and run my tarp out and stake it out. And I've got myself a 10 square foot or 15 square foot, whatever it is, dry spot and read a book while I wait for the rain to pass. And that's the beauty of the outdoors. The stress isn't there. If you want to cover 10, 15, 18 miles on a day, great. If you only get 3 or 4, but you read a great book or you have a great cup of soup or a fantastic cup of coffee while you're out there and you're smelling the pine trees or whatever it is, the freshness of that wilderness. Plus, whenever the rain comes, that smell that comes up out of the ground, it smells so fresh and so potent. Man, what a day, and I thoroughly enjoyed that. That's one of the reasons I like the tarps that go with, most hammocks. You can use a tent and still get a separate tarp that rolls up. But anyway, that's a whole nother story. We could spend hours on this, and many people have. But the Hennessy hammock is great. There are a number of other options now, and they typically come a lot of times in different configurations based on where you're at. If you're going to be in a tropical area, you don't need the same kind of thing you do in like a more temperate climate. In Missouri, where we get below 20, 15 degrees sometimes at night, a hammock presents some unique challenges because you're not on the ground, which is insulating you from underneath. So when you're in a hammock in colder climates, typically anything below about 40 degrees, you're going to start noticing it more pronounced in a hammock. You're going to want what's called an underquilt. An underquilt is like basically it's an open sleeping bag that clips to the bottom of your hammock because you lose all that heat on the bottom of the hammock when the breeze or the wind blows across that hammock. So you got to be prepared for that. The coldest I've ever done in a hammock was about, I know it was under 20. I think it was 17 or 19 degrees. I had 2 thermometers with me to check the accuracy. and I was very well prepared. The only thing I didn't know at the time, though, was the condensation that can happen if you use a space blanket. Again, a whole other conversation underneath your hammock. And so what happened was I was so warm that it was 17, I think, degrees. I'm pretty sure it was 17. I was so warm that I was literally sweating buckets inside this this hammock, and my breath and everything started to freeze to my mosquito net on the top of my hammock. It was an interesting trip. We'll talk about that some other time. Anyway, that's our daily dose of hammocks, and I prefer the hammock camping. You need to get used to it if you're going to try it. Make sure it's for you. But I love it because you can typically, I had mine to where I could set it up in about 3 minutes, and I could break it down in about 5 and be ready to go, and I never touch the ground. When you're in very wet climates, the mud becomes a problem, and everything just gets muddy, and the more mud you get, the dirtier it gets, and you drag it in, then it becomes dirt and dust inside your tent, and then it becomes heavier weight and so forth. So the hammock allowed me to get off the ground without having to worry about that. So I really enjoyed that. And the alcohol stoves, we'll actually make that a topic of a future show. Those are a lot of fun. So, all right, moving on to our next set of stories. Let me get a sip here. All right. We've got, I can tell right now we're not going to have time for that. We'll have to cut that story. The other thing, briefly, the neat thing about a hammock, too, is once you get it strung up in camp, you have these ridge lines, which are the ropes that tie the hammock to the trees. You can then dry your laundry on that. The hammock can be used as a seat. You walk over to it and just sit on it while you eat your lunch or read or just lay in it and stare at the stars or the sky. They're not for everyone. You need to make sure that you're comfortable sleeping in one. But for me, it was a good fit. I thoroughly enjoy them. I've had easily hundreds upon hundreds of miles on the trail in hammock camping and love it to death. All right, moving on. What do we got? We're going to hit this story briefly. Let me just reiterate and emphasize here at the MOA Broadcast, we don't like to tell you what to think or what to believe. We try and do what the news used to do, which is just give you the information, and you, as a mature adult or a younger person or whatever you are, make your own decision. That being said, sometimes you read things and it's interesting. Here is the headline. ABC News. 5 years since COVID declared public health emergency in U.S., still killing thousands. And I'm just going to read this verbatim. 2,861 deaths from the virus have already been reported in the last 28 days. This was written on approximately March 1st, if I recall. So they were talking basically about the month of February. There have been 2,861 reported COVID-19 deaths in the world. 2,861 deaths worldwide in the last 28 days, according to the WHO, the World Health Organization, with the U.S. making up 2,100 of those deaths. Hospitalizations and emergency department visits are also on the rise, and death rates for COVID-19 are at 1.8%, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Death rate is 1.8%. Now we move on to the flu. This is a slightly different story. That was from ABC News. This takes us to some state line analysis. Flu-related deaths hit a 7-year high in January and February 2025, the 2 months that usually account for the height of flu season, according to a state line analysis of preliminary federal statistics. This is the United States. There were about 9,800 deaths across the country. So 2,100 in the U.S. In basically the month of February, if I read that right. And in January and February, the flu was 9,800 deaths across the United States alone for the flu, not COVID. Just some information. While COVID-19 vaccines are available for adults and children, vaccination rates are low, according to the story at State Line. As of January 4, less than 25% of adults were vaccinated with the updated 2024 to 2025 COVID-19 vaccine, according to the CDC. There are still people who are being admitted who've never been vaccinated at all, and others who are not up to date in their vaccinations, the doctor said. So All I'm going to say about this is I didn't realize, I guess now it's going to become a yearly annual thing for a COVID-19 vaccine as well as the flu vaccine or shot. I don't know if these are still boosters or what, but all I can say is that's a lot of shots. Make sure you make your own determinations, folks. Do your research. I encourage you, whatever your decision is, make sure you make it from a place of education where you've read a lot and researched and talked to your medical and healthcare professionals. Don't just go by what's on websites. When in researching this, and I'll keep this extremely brief, I could go almost literally from one article to another, and they would contradict each other almost directly. So make sure you do your research, talk to your medical and healthcare professionals, and then make an informed decision. We want everybody to come out okay. All right, now we go to Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the lawsuit portion of the COVID, and we're going to have to keep this somewhat brief. We don't have a ton of time. A North Carolina mother and son can sue a public school system and a doctors group on allegations they gave the boy a COVID-19 vaccine without consent. This is the state of North Carolina, the state Supreme Court ruled on Friday, reversing a lower court decision that declared a federal health emergency law blocked the litigation. A trial judge and later the State Court of Appeals had ruled against Emily Happel, if I'm saying that right, and her son Tanner Smith, who at age 14, received the vaccination in August 2021 despite his protests at a testing and vaccination clinic at a Guilford County high school. According to the family's lawsuit, this happened at his high school. A 14-year-old boy received the vaccination despite his protests. So basically, in other words, almost against his will. Smith went to the clinic. That is the young boy, Tanner Smith, 14. He went to the clinic to be tested for COVID-19 after a cluster of cases occurred among his school's football team. He didn't expect the clinic would be providing vaccines as well. According to litigation, Smith told workers he didn't want a vaccination, and he lacked a signed parental consent form to get one. When the clinic was unable to reach his mother, a worker instructed another worker to, quote, give it to him anyway, end quote. Happel and Smith allege in legal briefs. Happel and Smith, that is the mother and son, sued the Guilford County Board of Education and an organization of physicians who helped operate the school clinic, alleging claims of battery and that their constitutional rights were violated. There's a whole bunch of stuff to unpack, but basically the defense of this situation cites the Old North State Medical Society from liability. It places broad protections. This is the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, shields the school district from liability, according to the school. Okay, the law places broad protections and immunity on an array of individuals and organizations who perform, quote, countermeasures, end quote, during a public health emergency. A COVID-19 emergency declaration in March 2020 activated the law's immunity provisions, Friday's decision said. So essentially, they gave this minor health care. They gave him a vaccination, a shot that he protested against, according to the lawsuit, and they did not have parental consent for. Now, forget for a moment. Again, we're not trying to bias anyone. Forget the fact that this is COVID and so forth. If you have a child, how would you feel? Just a question. How would you feel if they were administered health care with potentially negative ramifications or repercussions, as we've learned from some of these vaccines? Forget it's a vaccine, but just the idea they were administered emergency health care against their will and without your consent by their school. That's a messy situation. We're not going to have time to get into too much of that. Let's skip to the end. In particular, he wrote, this is Chief Justice Paul Newby, who wrote the prevailing opinion, said the federal law didn't prevent the mother and son from suing on allegations that their rights in the state constitution had been violated. So he was saying they could sue. It didn't prevent them from suing. In particular, he wrote, there is a right for a parent to control their child's upbringing and the right, quote, of a competent person to refuse forced, non-mandatory medical treatment, end quote. The federal law's plain text led to a majority of justices to conclude that its immunity only covers tort injuries, which is when someone seeks damages for injuries caused by negligent or wrongful actions. And to wrap it up, because, according to the judge, quote, because tort injuries are not constitutional violations, the PREP Act, cited earlier, does not bar plaintiffs' constitutional claims, he added, while sending the case back, presumably, for a trial on the allegations. I hope it goes well for him. That would be a scary situation. Have your child administered health care without their consent or your knowledge. Okay, folks, we're going to wrap it up. It's time to go yet again to Florida. I'm just going to read the headline, and you know where this is going to go. Drugged out Florida wacko who bit off chunk of flesh from cop's skull at music festival, sentenced for horrific attack. March 11, 2025, a crazed Florida man who chomped off a chunk of flesh from a cop's skull at a local music festival and then complained hair was stuck in his teeth, will spend the next 6 years behind bars for the horrific drug-induced attack. James Anderson, 37, was sentenced Monday for sinking his teeth into the head of a... Oh my gosh. I'm not making fun of the cop. This is insane. He was sentenced Monday for sinking his teeth into the head of a Holmes County Sheriff's deputy, ripping off a hunk of scalp and exposing the cop's skull at Sol Fest in Ponce de Leon on May 5, 2024, according to the state's attorney's office. A grisly photo of the cop's stomach-churning injury shows a gaping hole. Shows a gaping hole in the back of his bloody head. What is wrong with people? Now, I will say this article came from the New York Post. If you ever lived in New York, there were a variety of magazines and newspapers you could read for the daily news. The New York Post, they've always had a way with words, and I'll leave it at that. Violence against our local law enforcement officers will not be tolerated, and criminals that make the choice to do so will be held responsible, Chief Prosecutor said in a statement. According to him, this is the most severe bite wound I have ever seen in my career as a prosecutor, and this defendant is going to spend the next several years in prison paying for his violent actions. I can tell you, having been bitten in a violent altercation myself while someone tried to make a sandwich out of my leg, it's an interesting experience. The brute, I guess the aggressor, was working as a volunteer at the 4-day Music and Arts Festival when he tried to snatch the deputy's gun from his holster before savagely biting down on his noggin. Prosecutors said a combative Anderson was restrained by multiple officers after he resisted the effects of a taser. The violent wacko, according to the newspaper article, I think it's the New York Post, who was under the influence of PCP, LSD, ketamine, mushrooms, and ecstasy at the time, complained he had hair in his teeth after the rabid assault. Gosh. The deputy, who is not named, has since recovered with significant scarring. He pleaded guilty to aggravated battery on a law enforcement officer at Holmes County Circuit Court on Friday and will serve 10 years of felony probation upon his release. Okay, folks, that's it. He took a bite out of crime fighter. Remember, don't wait until you have an emergency to prepare for it. If you wait, it may be too late. If you don't make it out alive, you don't make it out at all. Stay safe out there, folks.